Okay, Garrett, both leaders there seem to be kind of coming to this meeting with some skepticism. What is each country trying to get out of this?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it. Look, for Mark Carney, he was elected in large measure as part of a backlash against President Trump and the way that the president has been talking about Canada and treating Canada in the form of these tariffs. Mark Carney has called it a betrayal. But upon landing in D.C. yesterday, as you can see there, he posted something on X basically saying that America and Canada are stronger when we work together, and that's what he wants to get back to. The president was right in his comments yesterday. Carney wants a deal. They want to get some kind of trade deal and get these tariffs on things like Canadian lumber and aluminum and steel and auto parts off the table. As for the president, he has said a wide variety of comments about Canada, suggesting he wants to get rid of artificial economic borders between the two countries and maybe even the borders altogether. Listen to this.
Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No. Economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
Our old relationship, based on steadily increasing integration, is over.
It's hard to square all of it on us, so we will all find out together in the next hour and a half or so whether we get a more constructive meeting like what Mark Carney was suggesting or something else.
Brian, remind us, where exactly do the tariffs stand right now between these two countries, and are we already seeing impacts because of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, we just got a fresh international trade and goods report from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they said that the trade deficit between the United States and Canada was around $4.9 billion just in terms of goods. And you can imagine that as the administration has been talking about wanting to lower the trade deficit and even provide a trade surplus in some cases to other countries, that's going to be the measuring stick for the administration in terms of trying to even trade here. But I think, as Garrett talked about, some of the major industries that are going to be of focus here, the automotive industry, which is so deeply intertwined with American manufacturing. There's so many goods that cross the border just between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. Also things like lumber. I think a lot of people forget that there is currently a review from the Department of Commerce into whether or not they want to tariff lumber. That would be a big deal for Canada, which exports a lot of lumber to the United States. And of course, steel and aluminum tariffs, which have been in effect, that 25% tariff, that is very much a big part of the conversation as well. But broadly speaking, again, the story here is the United States has been front-loading a lot of imports ahead of these tariffs in anticipation of that. This report reflects that. The trade deficit widening, although interestingly, most of that on an international basis was actually coming from pharmaceutical goods. So it suggests that maybe we weren't bringing in consumer goods like furniture, electronics, as some may have thought. That suggests that as long as these tariffs are prolonged longer than maybe companies were expecting, it could be more of a supply chain issue once we get closer to the holidays than even a pricing issue. Yes, prices might rise if you can even find that item at the store, Anna. And
then there's, of course, the backlash in terms of the way people are behaving in wanting to punish America. If you are in Canada, Canadians, Catherine, have notably started shunning American products and foods. We know McDonald's observed an uptick in anti-American sentiment abroad, particularly in Canada, which could hurt their bottom line. Just how important is Canada when it comes to the U.S. economy?
Well, we are a much bigger share of Canada's trade than Canada is a share of our trade. But there are some industries in the United States that are very sensitive to sentiment in Canada and resentment among Canadians against the United States. Tourism is another great example of this. If you look at the data on trips planned by Canadians to the United States over the next few months, it has plummeted year over year. And that's because a lot of Canadians, well, first of all, don't want to patronize the United States after having been derided so much by Donald Trump, that they should just be simply a province of our country, but also because there's a lot of fear of what happens if you come here as a foreign tourist. Having to register with the government if you're here for longer than 30 days, these horror stories about people being detained at the border or otherwise mistreated. So there's still a lot of tension between these two countries. And if you are, for example, a tourism-focused business in Florida, which attracts a lot of Canadian snowbirds, that's going to be very painful for you. Many of the other kinds of commodities that Brian just laid out that Canada sells us, lumber, steel, aluminum, auto parts, lots of these kinds of products that we buy from them. Yes, it'll hurt Canada. It will also hurt the United States. We're buying that lumber because we need it to buy homes. We're buying their fossil fuels because we need it to heat our homes and run our factories and businesses. So no one's going to get out of this scot-free.
Here is the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, ahead of today's meeting. Listen to this.
They have been basically feeding off of us for decades upon decades upon decades, right? They have their socialist regime, and it's basically feeding off of America. I mean, the president calls that out all the time. Why do we make cars in Canada? Why do we do our films in Canada? Come on. So I think the president's going to have... I think it's going to be a fascinating meeting. I'm glad I'm going to be there listening, but it's going to be a fascinating meeting tomorrow. I just don't see how it works out so perfectly.
Brian, he claims that the U.S. has been getting ripped off for years, but let's remember, President Trump negotiated the last trade deal with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. So where does this about-face come from, and what could the U.S. potentially get out of some kind of new deal with Canada?
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting rhetorical aspect of these negotiations between Canada, but also with Mexico as well, where the Trump administration is trying to frame the United States as being ripped off, even though the current framework for trade between those three countries is the USMCA, which was negotiated during his first term. Now, what's so interesting about the current tariffs that are putting into effect? Let's take, for example, the automotive tariffs. So there's an interesting provision inside the U.S., or inside the current tariffs that says any sort of car part that comes, let's say, from Canada that is currently compliant with that framework that was negotiated under the first term, the USMCA, is not going to face a 25% tariff until the United States can figure out how much of that car part is not made in the United States. So it's like an exemption. It's like an asterisk to an asterisk, which suggests that the United States wants to scrap the entire USMCA and then maybe renegotiate a whole brand new trade agreement. So yes, there are these USMCA exemptions for some of these tariffs. But again, the heavy suggestion here is that the U.S. wants to scrap President Trump's own original negotiation, agreement and create a brand new one. What does that look like? We don't know, but you can imagine that meeting today between, Mark Carney and President Trump will be kind of the first step in figuring out what that might look like.
And you'd point out just how kind of tangled everything is. It is complicated. It's not so simple. Garrett, the White House just put out a release this morning touting National Small Business Week, even as small business owners keep saying that these tariffs will crush them. Here's one from Minnesota.
I have maybe 2 months worth left in my warehouse in Minnesota. And when that's gone, I have no more revenue. I cannot pay my employees. I cannot pay my bills. I cannot pay the loans, which I have leveraged my house against. So we could lose our house. I do not have the $230,000 that were just immediately dropped in front of me to get my products into the U.S.
Garrett, how's the White House planning to help this woman? Are there plans?
No, the short answer is no. The president's been clear that he's not going to put any exemptions in place for small businesses when it comes to the tariffs. He was pressed about that by Kristen Welker over the weekend. And it is a huge problem. I've done so many of these stories. The fear is that big businesses that have massive warehouses and the ability to take, big quarterly losses if they have to, can weather whatever uncertainty comes with the tariffs. But smaller business owners, like the woman you just saw there, don't have the same cushion, and they could ultimately get squashed. Right now, the White House's line on this is that ultimately, the tariffs, they believe, will make the entire economy stronger. A rising tide lifts all boats, if you will. But so far, no sign of that tide coming in on it.
Catherine, in theory, solidifying trade deals with allies like Canada, like the EU, should be easier. But if Trump plays hardball and he drags this out, does that now give China more opening to fill the void?
I think that's a huge risk here. Again, as we have discussed, Trump actually struck a deal in his first term with Canada, with Mexico, the USMCA. At the time, he said it was the greatest deal ever negotiated. Now he's ripping that up. So first of all, our allies cannot trust the United States and or Trump to keep our word if, in fact, we come to a deal. And because we are alienating so many of our allies, we are in many ways emboldening China. As viewers may recall, there was a meeting an economic dialogue between China, South Korea, and Japan maybe about a month ago, their first economic dialogue in 5 years. these three countries historically do not like each other very much for all sorts of reasons. And Trump has driven them together. He is driving many of our most important allies into the arms of China, which ostensibly we should be linking up with our allies if we have common interests in keeping China in line.
In some non-Canada economic developments, we've covered how President Trump has been, saying people will need to buy fewer dolls potentially because of his economy. But Brian, now we're hearing from Mattel, maker of Barbie and Hot Wheels, that they have suspended their 2025 guidance. How significant is this?
Yeah, we're hearing from the doll companies directly now. And as you mentioned, yes, there is that concern that they don't even have the ability to model out how much money they'll be making. But from a consumer standpoint, they also said, interestingly, on that same earnings call, that they'll take where necessary, they'll take pricing action in their U.S. business, meaning that they could raise prices for the dolls that are on the shelf. But it's not just dolls, Hot Wheels as well. Mattel makes a number of other toys. But I think this underscores, the real crux of that 145% tariff that we're talking about, specifically with China. We don't import as many toys from Canada, but when it comes to China, some estimates out there, 75% of toys that are imported into the United States come from China. So what we're talking about here are Christmas gifts, because the holidays are obviously a few months away. People aren't thinking about necessarily going to the store to buy early quite yet. But if you are a supplier, if you are a Target or a retailer that's trying to have the shelves ready for, let's say, October or November prime shopping season, you're ordering those things right now if you haven't already. So I think the question here is, when does the concern about the tariffs actually transcend the pricing aspect of it and even into a supply chain issue? As I was kind of mentioning earlier, some of the data that we've been seeing suggests that actually maybe companies weren't front running as many of these consumer goods as we thought, meaning that the conversation is going to be more about, is the item on the shelf, as opposed to how much is the item on the shelf going to increase in price.